Welcome to the Chicago Interactive Design and Development Meetup group. That's a mouthful. I'm Judy Wunderlich. I've been running this group for 5 years now. And I'm also one of the partners and co-founders of the WunderLand group. Yeah, we got our plugs in there. So without anything else, I'm going to introduce you to a team of 3 people from Roundarch Isobar. Joe Haas, Michelle Dash, and Bill Walensky, right? Walensky? Yes. Walensky. Got that right. And they're going to tell you everything you want to know about responsive design. Thanks.
Warm good evening to everybody. I'm Joe Haas. This is Michelle Dash, and this is Bill Walensky. I screwed it up, didn't I? Walensky. Now, just to give you an excuse for that, would either of the 2 people who have worked at Roundarch longer than 9 days like to tell people about Roundarch?
I'm Michelle Dash. I'm a user experience lead at Roundarch Isobar. We're an interactive design agency consultancy in the Loop. We have about 150 people in our Chicago office, and we have a New York office, a Boston office, and a Denver office. So we have a huge user experience department, developers, designers, account managers, and basically work on huge web projects, mobile projects, touchscreen, anything in the interactive space. Any other questions about Roundarch Isobar for now? Okay.
So we're going to cover 8 topics this evening. We're going to talk a little bit about how we got here in terms of the idea of responsive design. We're going to answer the question of, is responsive design a fad? We're going to talk a little bit about deconstructing responsive design, what the portions of it are, how you approach the design process when you're working with responsive design, benefits and pitfalls of it. The one-slide answer to should you use responsive design? Yes, it's in one slide. Looking into the future of how responsive design is going to progress and move forward. And finally, we're going to reconstruct responsive design because we deconstructed it a little earlier in the program. If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand, shout them out. Please remind me to repeat the question so that A, it's on the audio, and B, everybody can hear it. So let's start by looking at how we got started. Back in 1996, I used this date arbitrarily, we started with the desktop. This, by the way, is a website that is still live. If you go to the URL at the bottom, and I'll give you a link at the end to all of these URLs, so no need to squint. This site still remains active as a glorious remembrance of that sad, sad moment when Bugs Bunny sold out to Michael Jordan. We had the desktop, and I picked 96 because that's when AOL turned on the switch and let all of their users suddenly hit HTTP sites. And that's all we had. We all sat in front of desktops, in front of big monitors with low resolutions and surfed the web. Around 1999 came what was called WAP, or mobile. Now, this used originally its own programming language, but then modified itself into a variation of HTML called XHTML. Now, during that time, you were able to use standard feature phones to be able to access the web. But you were limited in terms of what you could do. As you see, everything is very, very text-based. You're basing it on a phone that in all likelihood has got an up, down, left, right, and a go button. It's basic because at that point there wasn't really much bandwidth. We aren't talking about 3G networks. We're talking about 2G or 1G networks at the time. But this is what was originally pushed as mobile. And then one day in 2007 in Cupertino, a guy got up on stage and held up a device. And he declared that this was it because it had a full-featured web browser built into it. Yes, there were BlackBerrys that had their own separate browsers, but this was different because the key was this was the real web. And what was interesting is that what he proceeded to show was a screenshot of the New York Times homepage, which appeared on the phone. Suffice to say, trying to look at a website that's designed for 1024 wide browser in a phone with a pixel count of about 400 doesn't really give you an optimal web experience. So what started to happen at that point was companies started to develop their own mobile versions of the web, and that became what we now call the mobile web. It uses HTML just like your standard browser, but now obviously we've adjusted for how individual pages, we've adjusted it for mobile devices so that functionality is adjusted, text is adjusted, various adaptations have been made. Now, in the process of doing this, in the last year to 18 months, there came upon this idea of what's called responsive design. Because the key is that those three websites have their own URL. That's a mobile site for Yahoo, YouTube, a mobile site for Google, a mobile site for ESPN, but they have their own individual URLs. The idea was proposed that using what's called cascading style scripts, or CSS3, because we're on the third version of it now, you could build a website that with a high enough functioning browser would be able to adapt to how users work. So let me show you an example. This is the Boston Globe website. Boston Globe originally was based at boston.com. They decided they were going to go the path of paywall, so they decided to migrate to their own special URL. And you can see here that as the width of the page gets smaller, things start shifting around. The columns get smaller, the content starts to shift, and now suddenly, if you notice, we go from a 3-column layout to a 2-column layout. That content in the top right corner disappeared. Your digital and home delivery is gone. And things have continued to shift, and as we keep going smaller and smaller, we're down to a single, and you see where, again, now that search bar has become a button, everything has changed automatically. And it's all based on what the website determines the width of your browser is. That width determines what gets served up. And that's the idea of responsive design in a nutshell. A single web page that is adaptable to various widths and adjusts accordingly. So the follow-up question winds up being, is responsive design a fad? And we've got 4 common terms that are being thrown around these days. We've got that weird symbol, which is the official symbol for what's called near-field communication. How many people have heard of NFC? Decent number of people. To the top right is our friend, the ubiquitous QR code. Who knows about QR codes? Okay, reasonably common. Bottom left, Pinterest. Show of hands, Pinterest. Yep. And the bottom right, cloud computing. That whole concept, all reasonably well known. So the question becomes, is this a fad? Because each one of those 4 areas isn't exactly established. They're not ubiquitous yet. NFC, for example, everybody talked about how with the launch of the iPhone 5, the question was going to be raised of would it have NFC capabilities. It did not. The other big phone right now, the Samsung Galaxy S3, does have NFC functionality, and that's that ability to be able to take the phone, touch it to something, and be able to establish contact similar to pass cards you might have to get into the office, or a Chicago card, for example. QR codes took off like a rocket overseas, but here in the US, it's been kind of iffy. Yes, they're ugly, and they're not really designed right. For example, it's great to take a QR code and put it on something, which you'd use a phone to take a snapshot of it, and then have it go to the full website instead of the mobile site. Because, of course, that's the logical place you want to go when you're on your phone. Pinterest is the social networking fad, I would say, at this point. It could be a fad. I know that everybody and their mother who works with a client got calls when they started hearing about this taking off and asking if they should put a Pinterest button on every single page of their content, including the one that's nothing but text. And then in the bottom right is the idea of cloud computing, which is a larger conversation of pushing content and applications onto the web, similar to, say, Google Docs. So how does responsive design fit into this? Well, we're not 100% sure. It's been around. It tends to get talked about a lot, especially amongst those clients who have just enough knowledge to be dangerous. They read one or two magazines. You know the types. I'm seeing nods out there in that audience. They see one or two, and they come in that next morning, and they go, I know what we need to do. We need to look at going to a responsive design website. So let's build it in responsive design. And you go, well, we aren't actually doing any web work for you right now, and that would require something a little bigger. And then at that point, the account person jumps in and goes, we'd love to build you on a responsive design site. If you can get us something inside, we'll get launched on that right away. So at this point, it's a question of how much is it being adopted? And we'll show you some sites that are, and I'll tell you there's a significant number of sites that launch that aren't. And a little later on, we'll get into some of the decision making. The key is, how responsive do you want your site to be? Where are you going to move that lever on that throttle? Are you going to keep it right there in the middle or even pull it back? You're not sure? Or are you damming the torpedoes and full speed ahead, thrashing off those handles and breaking it off like a good Bugs Bunny cartoon where you're looking at the handle and the cables are coming out the top? It all depends, because there are different ways in which we can build upon the idea of responsive design. For example, there's fluid design. An image will adjust its size based on the viewport size or the display size. Sorry about using the dollar word when I could have used the 5 center. So if you're looking at it in a 600 pixel view, you'd see this picture of the Chicago skyline like this. But if you're in a 768 pixel view, it would resize to be able to automatically fill that entire screen. Where this comes in handy is if you've got an image and you want to be able to have it adjust to fit that area. In responsive design, you're able to code in such a way that it will adjust accordingly on the fly. Now, obviously, you saw it when we were designing, or we were showing off bostonglobe.com, you saw a little bit of that as columns were resizing on the fly. Same theory with images. Next, there's the idea of contextual design. This is the idea that you're going to design an experience based on how people generally use your device. Now, we understand that not every project can afford a significant 5-figure budget for anthropological research, user personas, and testing. But we can generally say, according to Whitney Hess, that you can divide them into 3 groups, and how people use these groups are as follows. On a mobile device, I want to check something. I'm looking at it. I just want to validate something and then move on my way. On a tablet, I want to immerse because I've got this big screen of real estate, but I am on a device that's a little less powered than a desktop or a laptop, a PC. And on a PC, the decision is that you want to manage. This is where you're at a full-function browser, full-function computer, and that's where you want to be able to do the heavy lifting that's necessary. And by making those adjustments, that'll help you decide what you want to build and how. Next is the idea of a contextual design display, that a common element will inherit the look and feel of a device that it's built on. So for example, if you're building a drop-down menu, you know that on a phone, a drop-down menu, if you're using iOS, for example, and you use the drop-down menu, it has the little display at the bottom. And that scrolls up and down, and that's how you use a drop-down menu, as opposed to on a tablet or a PC, in which you wind up having the classical look of a drop-down menu. And by adjusting for that, by adjusting your design for that, you're able to adapt appropriately. For example, on the earlier versions of iOS, the drop-down menus would not resized to show you everything that was on that drop-down item. So what would happen is you would have this big, long, nice 30-character description. The copywriter poured his or her art into it. It got vouched by the client who demanded 3 extra characters because somebody in legal didn't have their brand flakes that morning. And by gosh, it's the perfect 23 characters. And then they go onto the phone and they click on that drop-down menu, and all they see is the first 5 characters, an ellipse, and the last 6 characters. And they have to then try to figure out what that's supposed to mean. Now, fortunately, iOS has adapted to that, and now it does resize to be able to show you the whole thing. But I can tell you a lot of times where I would see very long drop-down menus on mobile sites that were impossible to understand because you had to be able to decipher the middle port. You had to decipher it based on just the first 4 letters and the last 5 letters. Did you have some? Okay. So taking that contextual design and baking it in allowed you to, again, take advantage of responsive design. And that leads to the idea of building a responsive design with server-side components. Now, the last 3 words are key, and they're a little scary because we're now starting to talk about servers. And if you're in the UX world, servers are for the production folks. Bless their hearts. Just keep the hamsters running, would you? Would you please? Thank you. We tend not to worry about it. But when it comes to responsive design, it's important. Because what will happen is the page will redesign itself based on the viewable width of the browser, as I showed you a couple of slides ago. But here's the key. It will only send the pieces it needs to build the page. When responsive design first came out, the idea was that it would push every piece of content that was possibly needed onto the web page. And then the browser would use the cascading style scripts, the language within the page to determine what stays, what goes, and where. That was fine, except for the fact that if you're in a mobile device, you're not at a speed premium. You're on a 3G or a faux 4G network. And in those cases, it takes a while. And it slows it down and makes users wonder if there's something wrong. When they added the idea of a server-side component, that allowed the use of a responsive design site to be able to thin down the amount of content, freeing up bandwidth, increasing speed. And there, as you can see, is a couple of examples. I don't know why the PowerPoint god decided to eliminate the third one, but I apparently did not do enough sacrifice to them this afternoon. But as you can see, when we go from a wider view to a mid-size view, what happens is that this left navigation gets moved up to the top, and the one that would be here had the PowerPoint gods liked me, only had this middle area. These graphics on these images on the right-hand side were not there. So what that means is that if you're on a native mobile device, which would have that very simple area, it's not going to send all of those graphics. That's going to reduce load time, and it's going to allow it to load faster and have a better user experience. Any questions so far? Okay, great. So I want to tell you a story about Jacob Nielsen. How many people in the room know who Jacob Nielsen is? Reasonable enough. For those who don't, Jacob Nielsen is considered one of the founding fathers of user experience. And I was able to get a photo of myself with him at a conference, which I then proceeded to send to some of my former coworkers who we all used to believe that Jacob Nielsen was actually a myth, a fictional character, kind of one of those legends like Robin Hood or Maid Marian. And when I sent this picture to them, they said, see, you just did a good job with Photoshop. Because clearly there's no real Jacob Nielsen. So Jacob Nielsen earlier this year wrote an article, and in the article it was actually his weekly newsletter. He said, everybody needs 2 sites. You need a mobile site and a desktop site. They should have separate URLs, and you should be able to quickly interact and cross between the two sites. So that if you happen to be on an iPhone and you need the full site, you should be able to click a view full site button and you jump over, and vice versa. Now, you have a community like interaction designers who are very web and very opinionated. And what, of course, happened was that everybody got their underwear into a bit of a bunch because they interpreted this as an attack on responsive design. How dare you? You don't know anything about responsive design. You're out of touch with reality. Responsive design is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And how can you put it down like that? And it got to be quite a kerfluffle to the point where Nielsen went to an interviewer and started talking about it. And the interviewer said, "So what do you really think of responsive design?" And here's what he had to say. "I was writing about user experience, not implementation. Responsive design is one of the ways to achieve different user interfaces for different devices. It should be up to the engineers to determine the most efficient way of achieving the user experience goals. All we usability people should decide is how the site should work for users, not how this is implemented." I'm a fan of Jacob Nielsen. I like the guy a lot. Clearly, I had my picture taken with him. Bless his heart, he lives in a vacuum. Because no one who works in user experience works alone. You work with creatives, you work with account people, you work with developers, you work with business analysts. Everybody has skin in the game. And to argue that somehow user experience people don't have a concern beyond simply how to create the best user experience is to deny the very nature of how we do our jobs, whether you're in the agency world or on the client side or in the consultancy business. You don't work alone. And that, at its core, is how responsive design needs to be approached from a usability perspective. So I'm going to hand it over now to Bill and Michelle, who are going to talk a little bit about approaching the design process when you're talking mobile versus tablet versus desktop.
So now for the slightly less animated and drier portion of the presentation.
Yes.
We're going to talk a little bit about how we actually take this idea and the theory of responsive design and how on a practical basis, how we implement that into the design process that we're all familiar with. So at the end of this, you won't necessarily have a recommendation of exactly what to do, but you'll know the right questions to ask in order to get started.
So one of the things that I work with a lot is working with enterprise clients and porting their data from large complicated systems over to simpler websites and applications that are accessible for users. A lot of this has to do with how you present the data in front of the user, less to do with where the data originated. I'm sorry, I work for the U.S. Air Force, so like what I work on every day is like really confidential, and I'm trying to like process through my head like what I can say and what I can't. If there's like gaps, that's why I'm doing that. Our users primarily sit at a desk and work with data applications to pull data out from a gigantic data warehouse. And what we decided to go with for a mobile approach for them, we developed a prototype last year, was an iPad application that sort of demonstrated how you can give a little immediacy to that data rather than presenting it in such a large viewport as the desktop, right? So how do you take data like how many F-16s you have, at the ready over the course of 10 years and put some like portion of immediacy to that data, and like what that means to you when you're looking at it on an iPad versus what you're looking at when you're sitting at your desk. And one of the big keys here is talking about like where your different pieces of content are coming from and how you display that. and the different contexts that that means in the way that the user is using it. So by way of example, if you have a data grid in your desktop application that is flagging things as being problematic and areas that you should look into because you need to keep airplanes flying, you might be looking at that over the course of a longer period of time. But when you're actually on a flight deck, actually like you're in a hangar, looking at how many planes you have currently to repair, the way that you present that data is different. And how you pull that data up and where it comes from and everything is impacted when you're on a mobile application, because you're dealing with a lot of bandwidth issues and whatnot. You could be going off of current, like a 3G connection or a 4G connection now. Of course, the prototype that we developed is an intranet application. You would not be doing that over a cellular network, so no worries about that in our case, but just something to keep in mind.
So kind of thinking about the content entry, of the content display of what Bill talked about, we really shift our framework to think about a very component-based design and designing each piece of the website as its own individual module or component, whether it's functionality, content, or images. And a lot of times, at least the way that I've worked on mobile websites versus desktop websites before, we pull from completely kind of different stacks of images, have different content. And the idea is, how do we streamline this and come up with a way that it's manageable to create these different experiences without creating 50 different experiences? So one approach is called the Goldilocks approach, where you design one for a small, medium, and large experience. So like we talked about earlier with mobile, you would have maybe a lighter experience or something more focused on action, where a tablet experience would be the medium experience that would be somewhat immersive but also actionable, and then a desktop experience that is really the most rich and the most immersive experience and has the most features. One thing that we do is we design for devices and specific browsers. And with this approach, you're just designing 3 things for small, medium, and large, with the assumption that any device is going to fit into one of these categories. And it might not be pixel perfect, but roughly it's going to work on whatever browser size you're looking at and look just about right. The next kind of question you should ask yourself before a responsive design project is, how do I get started? Do I start with the large desktop immersive experience, or do I start with the mobile experience, the lighter experience? And this is somewhat of a controversial topic, and it definitely has spawned a lot of really, really interesting discussions because nobody seems to agree on a small project team and even less on a large project team. I think traditionally the way that I've designed was from a desktop experience. So starting with the most complex and then taking things away to go to the mobile site. And that's typically because I usually work on desktops and the mobile is an afterthought. But responsive design, you're thinking about everything from the beginning. So it may make sense on your project to start with the smallest experience and then build on it for the desktop. The other thing is, with the proliferation of mobile devices and tablets, people are using them more, buying them more, and consuming more information through them. As users' focus changes, we need to change our approach to design.
Another thing to add about mobile first is that we really need to consider what the next billion users of the internet need and where they're coming from, because we have entire generations now that are experiencing technology for the first time in Africa, for example. They skipped an entire generation of technology and they never had desktop computers. They never had things like cables running between their homes to provide their internet. They're going straight to wireless towers on a cell phone. And these people are using the internet. They're doing the same things. They're looking for the same information that we are when we're using the internet, but they're doing it from their perspective, and it's a perspective that's completely has completely different history to it than what we have. So that there's a certain argument for going mobile first in certain geos versus focusing on others. for, excuse me, your traditional design for desktop first in a geo like ours, where you know that users are going to have multiple devices.
The gentleman who has really led the charge when it comes to mobile first is Luke W. And if you simply search Luke W. on the internet, you'll find him and you'll find his blogs. The two charts that are at the bottom here are kind of a roadmap of where things are standing. One came from Gartner, was in the journal yesterday, that year over year last year, there was an 8.3% drop worldwide in PC sales. And it ain't all about waiting for Microsoft to release Windows 8. And on the other side, you've got, and unfortunately there was even fresher data, but I couldn't massage it in time. So this is from 2007 to 2009, but you can rest assured it's still going. The number of users in third world country, or not third world countries, in what we would call developing countries that are mobile users is increasing by factors of 2 and 3. China, 260%. India, 211%. Brazil, 167%. Indonesia, 300%. And those numbers are growing. They're growing by leaps and bounds. And just to close the loop on the idea of a generation, I think of the fact that there are people who are just now getting into college for whom the idea of the internet has become, they've not only have they not had an internet, they've not had a mobile internet. They barely remember WAP, and for them, it's all about an HTML5 mobile web and that shift.
So with any new process or methodology, there's always pros and cons. And even though we talked about responsive design maybe being a fad and maybe not, we're not sure. There are some good and some bad. So some of the good things, it creates a cohesive experience for users. So a cross-platform experience. The content and the functionality are extremely flexible and very targeted because we're targeting towards the user needs, not just the devices. The management, optimization, you're now storing everything in one content management system, and everything was thought about from the beginning as one website, not 3 websites pieced together and copy and pasted over and over again. And it has a longer shelf life because we're thinking about, our website isn't going to break when there's a browser update or a new device comes out or the next generation of a phone changes their screen sizes slightly.
And then speaking towards some of the pitfalls, one of the things to consider with responsive design is that it does take longer to design. You are going to find that you'll have to spend as much time designing a responsive mobile experience as you do a mobile experience that uses its own independent code base and everything. Maybe it saves down on development time. I'm not a developer. I can't speak to that. But what's that?
Takes longer.
It does take longer, Michelle says.
So because a lot of developers aren't necessarily experienced at doing responsive design, there's somewhat of a learning curve. And also, to Bill's point about it taking longer to design, you're building 3 wireframes at least for every single page that we're used to only building 1. So just the sheer amount of work, it's 3 times the amount of work of a regular website.
Absolutely, and getting clients on board with that is one of the bigger challenges there, because you can't just tack on a couple weeks to a project and say this is going to be responsive. It's 3 separate sites that you're still designing for, and you have 3 steps of approvals. You have sign-offs that you have to get. You have different sets of documentation that you still have to produce. So while it looks cool in the front end of the browser, to the user, there's a lot of work that goes on in the back end, and that still is impacted the same way as it is if you're developing a mobile site separately. And then also you're relying, Joe threw this bullet point in here at the end, you're relying on the device sensing capabilities at the server level and picking up signals from that device to determine which version of the site to send out and hoping that that's correct. I actually had this happen. I forget which site it was actually on, but this happened a couple weeks ago where I pulled up my my desktop and I had my browser window shrunk down, and I was like, why does this site look weird? And then I was like, oh, it's because they're sending me the tablet version. They detected the screen resolution of my viewport on my browser and resized the window, and sure enough, there's the normal site there. That can be disruptive to the user. Like, I was just expecting to see the full site and to be able to scroll around and have it behave like it normally would, but I was like, what is this? Why am I not seeing the site that I expected? You know, so there is definitely that.
One other catch with that is that when you're in the old school of I've got a desktop site and I've got a mobile site, you can have a link at the bottom that says go to mobile site, go to desktop site. So if the user is on the wrong site, it's a simple click to go to the other one. In a responsive design environment, there's no link. It's all it's all sensing in that device. Therefore, if it senses wrong, a user's out of luck. It's going to be stuck with whatever the server has decided to send down based on the device.
Magic 8 Ball? It depends. I mean, should we use responsive design? It depends on the project. There is no yes or no to this, and it has to do with your site needs, most importantly, from our perspective, your users' needs, and what they actually need the software to do. I think we'll pull up some examples and show you some of these are sites that we have worked on at Roundarch Isobar, and others are popular sites around the web that you may have heard of. Actually, pull up Roundarch Isobar first. This is our new company site that just launched a couple weeks ago, and we went with the 3 sizes approach. So there's a mobile, tablet, and a desktop version, or a small, medium, and large version. And then you'll see eventually it'll hit a break point where it will shift this, and there you go. And now we're at the tablet size, and then if we go even smaller, we get the smallest size. So that's that's the simplest way to do this. And this still, even internally, this required separate sign-offs and separate approval for each of the individual breakpoints. Now we're working on this internally as an internal project, so it's more dynamic and faster than it would normally be with the client. But so we kind of hit on this a little bit, and the idea of when you're designing for a desktop computer as your biggest display, now let's talk about designing for your TV as your biggest display. You're talking about, like, right now we're talking about a 1080p display as being high definition, and then we're looking out in the next 4 or 5 years or so at having even less than that, perhaps at having 2K and 4K screens available for consumers in their homes, and how you deal with, you're effectively dealing with like a Retina display in your living room at that point. You start to think about things like less about the size of the device, an iPhone versus a desktop computer, and you start to think more about the distance from the device, right? When you start talking about a TV, for instance, you're about 10 feet away from it, so you have a 10-foot interface, right? This is about a phone is about like a 16-inch interface, they call it, or something like that. And when you're further away from a device, your ways to directly manipulate it, deteriorate. And you have things like Microsoft trying to bridge that gap with the Kinect, which has actually been really successful, and it's really fun to play with. I got a Kinect as a gift, and then I sold it. And now I really want it back, because I didn't realize how cool it was to just like be able to wave my hand in front of the TV and like point at something on the screen. And that actually, like, in the 6 weeks that I had it, that I thought it was just like this really novel, weird thing that's impractical, it grew on me, and I found myself actually like preferring that over picking up the controller, turning the controller on, because I use my Xbox more to like watch media than I do to play games. I'm not a big gamer. And then there's a great quote in the Steve Jobs biography where he's talking about how he thinks he nailed TV, and there's a lot of speculation around what that is. Like, if Apple were to build a TV, would it be a TV that has Siri built into it? And so that brings us to not only are you designing for things like a 10-foot interface, but you're also designing a multi-device interface that has to do with voice control, right? So you tell your phone what you want to watch, it shows up on the TV, you're effectively using your phone as a microphone at that point, or you're just shouting it to the room, and you have to deal with multiple people in the room, and there's all these different types of interactions that you have to deal with that. So I just sort of went like futurism boom all over the place, so I'm sorry.
So having done a good hour and a good hour on it, it's time to put pieces back together. You know, responsive design is a method. It can be the right method. It is not always the right method. And it involves those factors we talked about earlier to help determine if that is what's right for you. Those key factors have to be kept top of mind throughout the process. That slide we showed you of the 6 key indicators, or the 6 key factors, have to be kept as your rationale as to what path you're going to go down. And finally, the idea of whether to go down responsive design is an everybody decision. Everybody gets a seat at that table. The creatives, the production people, the account people, the client, and the IXDs. Because it is such a different way of working that if everybody but one part doesn't get it, it's going to start falling apart real quick. And when it starts falling apart real quick, that's when certain other people will start getting a little bit more antsy, angry, whatever term you would like to use. We have a couple of websites here that are great resources. Net Magazine has a list of 50 fantastic tools. Brad Forst has a page that says this is responsive, and there's a great collection of 7 books on responsive design you do not want to miss. And if you're trying to scribble those down, stop scribbling those down and scribble this down instead. This is a Google link to every single link you saw tonight, all in one handy Google Docs document. Take a picture. If I can pose with this if you would like. I will then do signed self-addressed stamped envelope things afterwards. Well, we want to thank you, all of you, for coming out tonight. We hope you've learned something. We will be sticking around for follow-up questions and other sorts. If you are looking, Roundarch, I can tell you from my 9 days of experience, is an awesome place to work. And the locations and the current job opportunities are available on the Roundarch Isobar site. That link is also on the page that I showed you on the link earlier. So thank you again for coming out tonight. Drive safely. We'll be around. Have a good night.